What do you think? Have you ever had family members who seemed caring on the surface, but had darker intentions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to hear about your experiences with complicated family dynamics. 68 feels like standing at the edge of something you cannot quite name. Not old enough for real sympathy, not young enough to start over. It is an age where people start looking at you differently, not quite elderly, but no longer middle-aged either. They speak a little louder when they address you. Assume you need help with technology, offer their arm when stairs are involved. I spent my Tuesday morning the same way I had spent every morning for the past 4 years since retirement instant coffee that I made too strong. Yesterday's newspaper that I read too slowly, and the persistent squeak of my kitchen chair that I kept meaning to fix, but probably never would. The squeak had become oddly comforting, like a metronome, marking the rhythm of my solitary days. The house in Millbrook, Ohio had never been grand, just a modest 2-bedroom ranch with aluminum siding that needed painting and a driveway full of cracks that sprouted weeds each spring. But it was mine, paid off after 43 years of mortgage payments that had sometimes required choosing between groceries and heat during the lean years when Marcus was young. That counted for something. The neighborhood was quiet, filled mostly with working families and a few other retirees like myself who had planted roots and stayed. The morning was unusually quiet, even for a Tuesday. Most of my neighbors were already at work, their driveways empty except for Mrs. Peterson next door, who was probably settled in for her morning routine of coffee, crossword puzzles, and daytime television. Mrs. Peterson and I had an unspoken understanding. We kept an eye on each other's houses, brought in mail when one of us traveled, shared garden vegetables when harvests were good. It was the kind of neighborly relationship that develops between women who understand the value of companionship without intrusion. I was refilling my coffee, measuring out another generous scoop of grounds, because weak coffee felt like surrender somehow, when I heard the delivery truck rumble down Maple Street, UPS. By the sound of it, that particular heavy engine with frequent stops that meant someone was working their way through packages. I didn't think much of it. Tuesday deliveries were common in our neighborhood. Online shopping had become a lifeline for those of us who found driving more challenging than it used to be. The doorbell's sharp double ring cut through the morning quiet, followed by the familiar thud of a package, hitting my front step with more force than seemed necessary. Through the peephole, I watched the brown truck pull away, leaving behind a medium-sized box wrapped in plain brown paper. No return address visible from where I stood, which was unusual. Most packages these days came plastered with tracking numbers and corporate logos. I opened the door and bent down to retrieve it, my knees sending up their usual protest and reminding me why I had started doing those yoga videos in the living room every other morning. The movement had become part of my routine gentle stretches to keep my joints functional. Breathing exercises to manage the anxiety that had become my constant companion since the divorce from Marcus's father 30 years ago. The handwriting on the label made my breath catch in my throat like a fishbone. Thick black ink, all capitals, unmistakably precise. Marcus had written my address the same way since he was 12 years old. When his 7th grade teacher had praised his penmanship, and he had decided that messy writing was beneath him. Even as a child, he had been particular about such things, critical of anything that didn't meet his exacting standards. Dorothy Chen, 127 Maple Street, Millbrook, 044,654. Each letter was formed with mathematical precision, the kind of handwriting that suggested someone who measured twice and cut once in all things. I traced the letters with my finger, remembering how Marcus used to spend hours practicing his penmanship at the kitchen table, erasing and rewriting until every letter matched his mental template. I hadn't heard from my son in 4 years. Not since that awful Christmas argument that had started over something as simple as dinner plans and escalated into a full-scale character assassination. Marcus had accused me of being controlling and manipulative, of never truly understanding what it meant to be a supportive mother. He had said I had always made everything about myself, that I had driven his father away with my neediness and was now trying to do the same to him. The silence that followed had been complete and devastating. No birthday calls, no holiday cards, Nothing when I had been hospitalized for my gallbladder surgery last spring, and had lain in that sterile room hoping for some sign that my only child still cared, whether I lived or died. The nurses had asked about family, and I had made excuses about Marcus being busy with work, traveling, tied up with important projects. Anything to avoid saying the truth, that my son had written me off completely. Inside the house, I set the package on my kitchen table, next to the stack of bills I had been avoiding all week. The monthly statements had become a source of low-level dread, not because I couldn't pay them, but because they represented the narrowing scope of my life. Utility bills, insurance payments, prescription costs, the mathematics of aging, reduced to numbers on paper. The coffee maker gurgled its last drops into the carafe, and I poured myself a fresh cup, studying the box like it might explain itself if I stared long enough. It was heavier than I had expected, substantial in a way that suggested something valuable inside. The brown paper was high quality, not the cheap wrapping usually associated with hurried shipping. Someone had taken care with this package. The clear packing tape was applied with the same precision as the handwriting straight lines. No bubbles, corners folded with geometric accuracy. A simple green ribbon was tied around the middle, not decorative exactly, but purposeful. The whole presentation suggested thought, planning, care. It looked like something wrapped by someone who understood the importance of presentation. After 20 minutes of staring and second-guessing myself, my curiosity finally overcame my caution. I worked carefully at the tape, trying not to damage the paper more than necessary. Some ingrained habit from childhood, the idea that wrapping paper should be saved and reused. That waste was a kind of moral failing. Inside, nestled in layers of bubble wrap, were 6 mason jars of what appeared to be homemade preserves. Each jar had a different colored lid: red, blue, yellow, green, purple, and orange, creating a rainbow effect that was undeniably appealing. The handwritten labels were created with the same careful script as my address, each one a small work of art in itself. Strawberry rhubarb, peachinger, blueberry lemon, blackberry sage, mixed berry, apple cinnamon. The combinations were sophisticated, not the simple fruit preserves you would find at a grocery store. These suggested someone with real knowledge of flavor profiles, someone who understood how different ingredients could complement each other. The jars themselves were beautiful clear glass that showed off the rich colors inside, lids that looked hand-labeled with care. At the bottom of the box, tucked under the last jar and wrapped in tissue paper, like something precious, was a small note card. The paper was thick, expensive stock, the kind used for formal invitations or important announcements. The message was written in that same precise handwriting, but smaller, more intimate. For all the mornings I wasn't there to make breakfast. Hope we can talk soon, Marcus. I held the card for a long time, reading those words over and over until they started to blur. My throat felt tight, not quite tears, but something close, that soft ache that creeps in when you want something to be real, but don't trust it yet. 4 years of silence, and now this homemade preserves from a son who had never shown the slightest interest in cooking, who had lived on takeout and frozen dinners throughout his 20s and 30s. The preserves sat on my counter for the rest of the morning while I tried to process what I was feeling. Pride that he had learned to make something beautiful? Suspicion about why now. After all this time, gratitude that he had remembered how I used to make jam every summer when he was small, standing on a chair beside me in the kitchen, more hindrance than help, but so eager to be involved. I remembered those summer mornings vividly, the kitchen windows open to catch any breeze, the smell of fruit and sugar filling the air. Marcus's small hands helping to wash berries in the colander. He had been so careful even then, insisting that every berry be examined for flaws before it went into the pot. I had thought it was adorable, this attention to detail. Now, I wondered if it had been something else entirely. I didn't open any of the jars immediately. Something held me back, maybe caution born from years of disappointment. Maybe the memory of how our last conversation had ended with doors slammed and words that couldn't be taken back. Instead, I found myself thinking about Helen Morrison, my neighbor 3 houses down. Helen had been struggling since her husband passed last month. The poor woman had lost 15 pounds she couldn't afford to lose, barely eating according to her daughter. Rebecca, I had seen Helen in her garden just yesterday, moving like someone much older than her 72 years, her usual energy replaced by a kind of listless grief that made my heart ache. Helen had always been kind to me, especially after Marcus stopped calling. She would bring in my mail when I traveled to visit my sister in Cleveland, share vegetables from her abundant garden when harvests were good, shovel my walkway after snowstorms without being asked. When I had been in the hospital for surgery, Helen had been the one to water my plants and check on the house. If anyone deserved something sweet and homemade, it was Helen. And honestly, it felt easier to share Marcus's gift than to wrestle with what it meant. Sharing felt safe somehow, like it removed the pressure of having to respond immediately to his overture. That afternoon, as the sun reached that perfect angle that photographers call golden hour, I walked down Maple Street carrying 5 of the 6 jars in a canvas tote bag that had seen better days. I kept the strawberry rhubarb for myself. It had always been my favorite combination, and Marcus knew that. The tart rhubarb balancing the sweet strawberries, the way the flavors played against each other in perfect harmony. Helen answered her door in her worn terrycloth bathrobe, looking thinner than I had seen her since the funeral. Her usual bright smile was subdued, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and too much grief. "Dorothy? Honey, what is this?" she asked, looking surprised as I handed her the bag. Her voice carried that slight tremor that had developed since Robert's death, as if everything now required more effort than it once had. "My son sent me more preserves than I could ever use," I told her, which wasn't exactly a lie. "I thought you might enjoy them. They look too beautiful to let go to waste." Helen's face brightened for the first time in weeks, some echo of her old enthusiasm breaking through the grief. "Oh, you sweet thing. I was just thinking how plain my toast has been lately. Nothing tastes quite right anymore, you know." She peered into the bag, and I saw genuine delight cross her features. "These look absolutely gorgeous." "Did you make them?" "Marcus did," I said, and felt a strange mix of pride and uncertainty saying his name out loud after so long. Apparently he has taken up cooking. "Well, you tell him they are beautiful. Look at these colors. I cannot wait to try them." Helen held up the blueberry lemon jar, admiring the way the afternoon light caught the deep purple of the berries. "This looks like something from one of those fancy gift shops downtown." "He always was particular about presentation," I said, remembering how Marcus used to arrange his toys with geometric precision, how he would become upset if anything was moved from its designated place. "A boy who cares about making things beautiful? You raised him right." Dorothy Helen's words were intended as kindness, but they stirred something uncomfortable in my chest. Had I raised him right? The 4 years of silence suggested otherwise. I walked home feeling lighter somehow, like I had done something right for once. The empty spot on my counter where the jars had been didn't bother me. If anything, it felt like the beginning of something rather than an ending. Marcus's gift had brought joy to someone who needed it, and that felt like the right kind of response. That evening, I sat on my front porch with a cup of chamomile tea, watching the sunset paint our quiet street in shades of gold and amber. Mrs. Peterson waved from her garden, where she was deadheading her roses, and a young couple walked by with their golden retriever. The dog stopping to investigate every interesting smell along the way. Normal things. Peaceful things. The kind of ordinary beauty that you learn to appreciate when the bigger dramas of life have settled into routine. I went to bed feeling more content than I had in months, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Maybe it was the simple act of giving, of being able to do something kind for a friend. Maybe it was the possibility that Marcus and I might find our way back to each other after all this time. I fell asleep, thinking about those summer mornings in the kitchen, when making jam together had felt like the most natural thing in the world. The phone call came the next morning, just as I was making breakfast, the sound cutting through the quiet of my routine, like an alarm. The caller ID showed Helen's number, but the voice that answered wasn't hers. It was younger, more strained, filled with the kind of exhaustion that comes from spending the night in a hospital waiting room. Mrs. Chen. This is Rebecca Morrison, Helen's daughter. Mom's in the hospital. The words hit me like a physical blow. I nearly dropped my coffee mug, my hand suddenly unsteady. What happened? Is she all right? She collapsed around midnight, severe stomach pain, vomiting, couldn't keep anything down. By the time the ambulance arrived, she was dehydrated and disoriented. Rebecca's voice carried the particular strain of adult children dealing with a parent's medical crisis. The EMTs said she was barely conscious when they found her. My mouth went dry, and I had to sit down heavily in my kitchen chair. What do the doctors think it is? They are still running tests, but they think it might be food poisoning. She is stable now, but they have got her on IV fluids and anti-nausea medication. The blood work showed some concerning levels, but nothing definitive yet. There was a pause, and I could hear hospital sounds in the background monitors beeping. Voices over intercoms, the squeak of wheels on linoleum. Mom mentioned eating some jam yesterday that a neighbor brought over. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? The question hit me like ice water. I sank deeper into my chair, my legs suddenly unsteady. I gave her some preserves. They were a gift from my son. Preserves. Rebecca's tone sharpened, taking on the focused intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. What kind? Where did they come from? Exactly different flavors. Homemade. He sent them to me yesterday, and I thought Helen might enjoy them since she has been having such a hard time eating lately. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant and hollow. There was a longer pause, and I could hear Rebecca speaking to someone else in the background. Her voice muffled as if she had covered the phone. When she came back, her tone was more urgent. Mrs. Chen. Did you eat any of them yourself? No, I whispered, the word barely audible. I kept one jar, but I hadn't opened it yet. The doctors want to know exactly what she consumed. They need to understand what might have caused this reaction. Could you bring the jar you kept, and maybe the packaging or any information about where they came from? I promised I would and hung up the phone with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. In the kitchen, the strawberry rhubarb jar sat innocent and pretty on my counter. Its red gingham lid cheerful in the harsh morning light. Next to it lay the note card from Marcus, the words suddenly looking different under the fluorescent bulb. For all the mornings I wasn't there to make breakfast. The phrase that had seemed like an apology yesterday now felt ominous, loaded with implications I didn't want to examine. I grabbed my purse and keys, carefully wrapping the jar in a dish towel before heading to my car. The drive to Millbrook General Hospital felt endless, though it was only 12 minutes from my house. I kept thinking about Helen's pale face yesterday, how grateful she had looked when I had handed her that bag of beautiful jars. The hospital parking lot was already busy, despite the early-hour visitors arriving for morning procedures, staff changing shifts, the constant rhythm of medical care that never stops. I found a space near the back and sat in my car for a moment, trying to prepare myself for whatever I was about to learn. At the hospital, Rebecca met me in the waiting area near the emergency department. She was a tall woman in her 40s with tired eyes and worry lines that seemed to have deepened overnight. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she was wearing the same clothes from yesterday, clear signs of an unexpected night in crisis mode. We found a quiet corner away from the main desk, settling into uncomfortable plastic chairs that had seen too many difficult conversations. The smell of disinfectant was overwhelming, mixed with that particular hospital scent of anxiety and hope that I remembered from my own recent surgery. How is she? I asked first, needing to know before we discussed anything else. Better than last night, but still weak. They have got her on IV fluids and anti-nausea medication, and her vital signs have stabilized. The blood work showed some concerning levels elevated liver enzymes, some inflammation markers that shouldn't be there. Rebecca studied my face carefully. Mrs. Chen, I have to ask, is there any reason to think those preserves might have been contaminated somehow? I unwrapped the jar carefully, setting it on the small table between us. The strawberry rhubarb preserves looked innocent enough, the fruit suspended in a clear, dew-like gel that caught the fluorescent light beautifully. I don't know. My son and I, we haven't spoken in years. This was completely unexpected. Years, Rebecca raised an eyebrow, her expression shifting from concern to something more analytical. What kind of estrangement are we talking about? A disagreement that got out of hand, or something more serious? I found myself telling her more than I had intended. The words spilling out in the sterile safety of the hospital waiting room. About the fight over Christmas dinner plans that had escalated into Marcus, accusing me of being controlling and manipulative. About how he had said I would never truly supported his choices, that I had always made everything about myself, that I was the reason his father had left when Marcus was 15. He said I was toxic, I admitted. The words still stinging after all this time, that I suffocated everyone around me with my neediness. That he couldn't have a real relationship with anyone as long as I was in his life trying to control everything. Rebecca listened without judgment, her expression thoughtful. And now suddenly he sends homemade preserves after 4 years of silence. With a note about wanting to talk, I confirmed, pulling out the card to show her. But Marcus never cooked, never showed any interest in it. Even as a child, he preferred store-bought everything. He used to criticize my cooking, said homemade. Things were unpredictable and potentially unsafe. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, then pulled out her phone. I am going to call the lab and ask them to test this jar along with whatever Mom has left in her system, just to be safe. While we waited for the lab technician to arrive, I sat with Helen for a few minutes. She was awake but groggy, her usual bright smile replaced by exhaustion and confusion. When she saw me, she reached for my hand with fingers that felt frighteningly fragile. "Dorothy, I am so sorry about the jam," she said weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I feel terrible that something you gave me made me sick." "Don't apologize," I told her firmly, squeezing her fingers gently. "You have nothing to be sorry for. This isn't your fault." "It tasted wonderful," she continued, closing her eyes as if the effort of speaking was too much. "I had it on toast for dinner, then again before bed. The blueberry lemon was my favorite. It was like eating sunshine." She paused, struggling to find words. "I kept thinking how talented your son must be, how lucky you were to have someone who cared enough to make something so beautiful." The irony of her words was like a knife twist. I stayed until she drifted back to sleep, then drove home in a daze. The house felt different when I walked in, like someone had rearranged the furniture while I was gone. Everything looked the same, but something fundamental had shifted in the air itself. That evening, I found myself searching through old photo albums, looking for pictures of Marcus as a child. I found one from his 10th birthday, him standing next to an elaborate dinosaur cake I had spent hours making. His smile polite but distant even then. He wasn't touching the cake or looking at it with excitement like other children might. Instead, his eyes were focused somewhere off camera, as if he was already planning his escape from the celebration. Another photo from high school graduation showed him standing perfectly straight in his cap and gown, not quite touching the rest of the family in the picture. Even then, he had maintained that careful distance, that sense of being present but not fully engaged. I had attributed it to teenage awkwardness, but now I wondered if it had been something else entirely. I had always told myself he was just reserved, thoughtful, different from other kids in ways that made him special. But looking back now with the harsh clarity of hindsight, I remembered other things that had seemed odd at the time. The way he had watched me cook, taking mental notes of every ingredient and measurement. How he had asked detailed questions about which foods could make people sick, claiming it was for a school project on food safety. There was the time I had found him reading about poisonous plants in the library, explaining it away as research for biology class. The way he would react with disproportionate anger when meals didn't turn out exactly as expected. His insistence on knowing exactly what was in everything he ate, down to the brand names of spices and the source of vegetables. The phone rang around 9 of the clock, cutting through my increasingly dark thoughts. Unknown number. But something made me answer anyway. "Mrs. Chen. This is Dr. Patricia Valdez from the hospital lab. I understand you brought in a jar of preserves for testing in connection with Mrs. Morrison's case." "Yes," I said, gripping the phone tighter than necessary. Have you found anything? We have run preliminary tests on both the jar and Mrs. Morrison's blood samples. I need to ask you some questions about where these preserves came from, if you don't mind. My son made them. Or at least, he said he did. The words felt strange in my mouth, like I was speaking a foreign language. Mrs. Chen, we found traces of oleander in both the preserve samples and Mrs. Morrison's blood work. Oleander is highly toxic. Even small amounts can cause the symptoms Mrs. Morrison experienced. In larger doses, it can be fatal. I sat down hard on my kitchen chair, the room suddenly spinning. Oleander. It is a common ornamental plant, but every part of it is poisonous. The flowers, leaves, stems, even the sap can be deadly if ingested. The level of concentration we found suggests intentional contamination, not accidental contact. Dr. Valdez's voice was carefully professional, but I could hear the concern underneath. This wasn't someone who accidentally got plant material mixed in during preparation. Someone deliberately added oleander extract to these preserves. Are you saying someone put it there on purpose? The question came out as barely a whisper. I am saying this wasn't an accident, Mrs. Chen. Mrs. Morrison is extremely fortunate that she didn't consume more and that she received medical attention quickly. The amount she ingested was enough to cause severe illness, but not quite enough to be fatal. We are required to report our findings to the police. They will likely want to speak with you about the source of these preserves. After Dr. Valdez hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the empty space where the jars had been. The fluorescent light hummed overhead, casting everything in harsh detail. My son had sent me poison for my birthday. Poison disguised as a loving gift, wrapped with care and tied with ribbon. Poison I had given away to a grieving widow who had never done anything but show me kindness. The full weight of it hit me slowly, like cold water seeping through clothing. If I had eaten the preserves myself, if I had been the grateful mother who immediately sampled her son's thoughtful gift, I would be the one in the hospital. Or worse. Helen had saved my life simply by being someone I cared about more than myself. I walked through the house, turning on every light, checking the locks on windows and doors, with a paranoia I would never felt before. For the first time in 4 years, I was grateful for the distance Marcus had put between us. Grateful that he didn't have a key to my house, didn't know my daily routines anymore, couldn't predict my behavior well enough to ensure his plan would work. The police detective arrived the next morning at exactly 9 of the clock. Her timing suggesting this was a scheduled appointment rather than a casual visit. Detective Laura Santos was a serious woman in her 30s with intelligent eyes and the kind of presence that immediately commanded attention. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had dealt with family violence before and understood its particular cruelties. She sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and tape recorder, asking careful questions about my relationship with Marcus, about the package, about why I had given the preserves away. Her questions were thorough but not accusatory, designed to gather facts rather than assign blame. Can you tell me about your relationship with your son? When did you last speak before receiving this package? I told her about the Christmas argument, about Marcus's accusations, about the 4 years of complete silence that followed. She took notes without comment, occasionally asking for clarification about specific incidents or conversations. Do you have any idea why your son might want to harm you? She asked, eventually. I thought about it honestly before answering. He has always resented me, blamed me for his father leaving when he was 15. Though, that was David's choice. Not mine. He felt I was too controlling, too involved in his life. But murder, I shook my head. I never imagined he was capable of murder. What about financially? Would he benefit from your death? He is my only child, so yes. Eventually he would inherit the house and what little I have saved. But it is not a fortune by any means. Maybe 50,000 in savings. The house is worth about 120,000, hardly enough to kill for. Detective Santos made more notes, then looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Mrs. Chen, would you be willing to call your son? See if you can get him to say something about the preserves, or why he sent them. We had recorded the conversation, and it might help us understand his intentions. The idea terrified me, but I agreed. She set up recording equipment and coached me on what to say, how to guide the conversation without being obvious about it. My hands were shaking as I dialed Marcus's number, praying he wouldn't answer while simultaneously hoping he would. Marcus answered on the third ring, his voice cautious but not surprised, as if he had been expecting my call. "Hi, Mom, Marcus," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thank you for the preserves. They were beautiful." "Did you enjoy them?" There was something eager in his tone that made my skin crawl, a hunger for information that seemed too intense for casual interest. Actually, I gave most of them to Helen Morrison, my neighbor. She has been having such a hard time since her husband died last month. I thought something sweet might cheer her up. The silence on the other end stretched so long, I wondered if the call had dropped. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was different, tight with something that might have been anger or panic. "You gave them away?" The words came out sharp, almost accusatory. "All but one jar. Was that wrong?" I thought it would be nice to share something so special with someone who needed it. "Those were for you, Mom. Specifically for you." His voice cracked, not with sadness, but with frustration and something else. I couldn't identify, I know, but Helen loved them so much. She ate them right away, said they were the best thing she had tasted in months. The blueberry lemon was her favorite. Another pause, longer this time. When Marcus spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled, as if he was reading from a script. "How is Helen doing now?" "She is in the hospital. Actually, food poisoning, they think. She has been very sick. That is terrible. I hope she recovers quickly." But I could hear it in his voice, relief mixed with frustration. Relief that his plan had worked on someone. Frustration that it hadn't worked on me. "Marcus, where did you learn to make preserves? You never showed any interest in cooking before." "YouTube," he said quickly. Too quickly. "Amazing. What you can learn online these days. There are tutorials for everything. YouTube taught you about using oleander too." The line went dead immediately, the dial tone humming in my ear like an accusation. Detective Santos played back the recording twice, then made several phone calls while I sat in my living room, trying to process what had just happened. Within an hour, they had enough evidence for a warrant to search Marcus's apartment in Columbus. The search revealed more than anyone had expected. Marcus had been planning this for months, maybe longer. They found detailed notes about poisonous plants, printouts about oleander cultivation and extraction methods, and a journal documenting his growing resentment and his plans to solve the problem of his inheritance being tied up while I was alive. The journal entries were particularly chilling. Pages of calculations about dosage and timing, observations about my eating habits from our last Christmas together, speculation about how long it would take for symptoms to appear and whether anyone would suspect poisoning in an elderly woman living alone. Marcus was arrested that evening at his job at an accounting firm downtown. According to Detective Santos, he didn't resist but didn't admit to anything either. His lawyer advised him to remain silent, and he followed that advice completely. I didn't go to the arraignment. I couldn't bear to see him in handcuffs, even knowing what he had tried to do. Instead, I visited Helen in the hospital, bringing her flowers and sitting with her while she continued to recover. "I feel so stupid," she said. During one visit, her voice stronger than it had been but still fragile. "Eating something that could have killed me because it tasted good." "You are not stupid," I told her firmly. "You trusted a gift from someone who should have been trustworthy. That is not stupidity, that is being human. That is having faith in goodness." Helen recovered fully over the next 3 weeks, though she was never quite the same. The doctors said she had been fortunate her age, and the amount she consumed could have made things much worse. She moved in with Rebecca temporarily while she regained her strength, and I made sure to check on her regularly. Marcus's trial was scheduled for 8 months later, giving both sides time to prepare their cases. His lawyer tried to argue that the contamination was accidental, that Marcus had been experimenting with wildflower honey and didn't realize oleander was toxic. But the prosecution had his journal entries, his internet search history, the recorded phone call, and testimony from experts about the deliberate nature of the contamination. During the trial, I learned things about my son that shattered whatever illusions I had maintained about who he really was. How he had been researching various poisons for over a year, creating detailed files on different methods and their effectiveness. How he had practiced extracting compounds from different plants in his apartment's makeshift laboratory, using equipment he had ordered online under false names. The most disturbing revelation was how carefully he had calculated the dosage. He had researched my height, weight, and general health status, then determined exactly how much oleander would be needed to cause death in a woman of my age and physical condition. The preserves had contained enough poison to kill me twice over. The prosecutor painted a picture of a man who felt entitled to his inheritance and was tired of waiting for nature to take its course. The defense argued that Marcus was mentally ill, suffering from years of resentment and depression that had warped his judgment and made him incapable of understanding the full consequences of his actions. I testified about our relationship, about the 4 years of silence, about the phone call where he had revealed his frustration that I had given the preserves away. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, standing in that courtroom and helping to convict my own son. Every word felt like a betrayal, even though I knew he had betrayed me first. Marcus was sentenced to 25 years to life for attempted murder in the first degree. The judge noted the premeditated nature of the crime, the careful planning involved, and the fact that an innocent woman had nearly died because of his actions. As they led him away in shackles, he looked at me for the first time during the entire trial. His expression wasn't angry or remorseful, it was blank, like he was looking through me rather than at me. I moved out of the house on Maple Street 6 months after the trial ended. Too many memories haunted those rooms, too many neighbors who knew the story and looked at me with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. The whispers followed me everywhere at the grocery store, the library, the post office. I found a small apartment in a retirement community 2 towns over, where no one knew about Marcus or the preserves or the trial that had made local news. Helen and I stayed in touch, our friendship deepened by the shared trauma of what we had survived. She sent me Christmas cards and called on my birthday, and sometimes we met for lunch in the city between our 2 towns. We never talked directly about Marcus or what had happened, but there was an understanding between us we would both survived something that could have been much worse. The retirement community was a different world, filled with people who understood the challenges of aging without dwelling on them constantly. Sunset Manor was beautifully landscaped, with walking paths that wound through gardens designed for accessibility. My apartment on the 2nd floor had large windows that looked out over a small pond where ducks gathered each morning, and I found myself setting my alarm early just to watch them paddle around in the dawn light. I joined a book club that met every Thursday in the community room, where we discussed everything from contemporary fiction to memoirs about overcoming adversity. The other members, mostly women in their 70s and 80s, had their own stories of loss, betrayal, and resilience. Margaret had survived an abusive marriage that lasted 40 years. Patricia had lost a daughter to suicide. Eleanor's son had embezzled her life savings and disappeared. We never talked directly about our traumas, but there was an understanding among us, a recognition of shared survival. I started volunteering at the community garden, spending 3 mornings a week helping tend vegetables that were donated to the local food bank. The physical work felt good, grounding in a way I hadn't expected. There was something healing about nurturing plants that would feed people, about creating life instead of dealing with death. The other volunteers became friends, and we often shared coffee and conversation after our work was done. Dr. Patricia Martinez, the community's resident counselor, suggested I might benefit from joining a support group for people who had experienced family violence. The idea terrified me at first. The thought of sitting in a circle and sharing my story with strangers felt like another kind of violation. But eventually, I worked up the courage to attend a meeting. The group met twice a month in a small conference room off the main lobby. 8 women of various ages, all dealing with the aftermath of violence perpetrated by people who were supposed to love them. Some had been physically abused by spouses or partners. Others, like me, had discovered that family members were capable of things that defied comprehension. There was Janet, whose adult daughter had tried to smother her with a pillow during a dispute over inheritance. Maria, whose grandson had broken her ribs during a robbery attempt. Linda, whose brother had forged her name on loan documents and left her facing bankruptcy. Each story was different, but the underlying themes were the same: betrayal by those closest to us, the struggle to rebuild trust, the challenge of moving forward when the ground beneath your feet had shifted permanently. In those meetings, I learned that my experience with Marcus wasn't as isolated as I had believed. Family violence against elderly people was more common than most people realized, often hidden behind closed doors and disguised as caregiving or financial assistance. The statistics were sobering. 1 in 10 Americans aged 60 and older had experienced some form of elder abuse, and much of it went unreported because victims were ashamed or afraid. On quiet evenings in my new apartment, I sometimes wondered if I had missed signs when Marcus was younger. If there had been clues I should have recognized, moments when I could have gotten him help instead of watching him grow into someone capable of cold-blooded murder. The question haunted me, not because I blamed myself for his choices, but because I wanted to understand how I had been so blind to his true nature. Dr. Martinez helped me work through these thoughts during our occasional one-on-one sessions. She explained that many people who commit violence against family members are skilled at hiding their true intentions, that their ability to manipulate and deceive is often what makes them dangerous in the first place. She reminded me that even trained professionals sometimes miss warning signs, that the capacity for violence can be buried so deep that it is invisible until it suddenly isn't. But those thoughts led nowhere productive, so I tried to focus on the present instead. I learned to meditate, something I had always dismissed as New Age nonsense but found surprisingly effective for managing anxiety. I took up watercolor painting, discovering a talent I had never known I possessed. I adopted a small gray cat from the local shelter, naming her Grace because that is what she brought into my life. Unearned mercy, the gift of unconditional affection from a creature who asked for nothing but food and attention. The strangest part of the whole experience was the gratitude I felt. Gratitude that I had been raised to share, to think of others before myself. Gratitude that Helen had survived. Gratitude that 4 years of silence had probably saved my life by making me cautious about accepting gifts from a son I no longer really knew. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I had eaten those preserves on that Tuesday morning, if I had been the eager mother who immediately sampled her son's thoughtful gift. But I tried not to dwell on those thoughts. They led to a darkness I couldn't afford to explore. Instead, I focused on the lesson I had learned, that love without boundaries is dangerous, and that family ties don't guarantee safety. I had spent 68 years believing that blood relations meant something sacred and unbreakable. Marcus taught me that some bonds are better left broken, that survival sometimes requires accepting painful truths about the people we love. The last jar of preserves, the strawberry rhubarb I had kept for myself, remained unopened in my refrigerator until the day I moved. I threw it away without ceremony, jar and all, taking no chances with its beautiful, deadly contents. Some gifts aren't worth the risk, no matter how beautiful they look on the outside. Was I wrong to trust family even after years of silence? What would you have done in my situation? Let me know in the comments, and if you want to hear more stories about family secrets and unexpected betrayals, make sure to like and subscribe for more content like this.